Welcome to my video series covering the stories of classic Doctor Who. We start with the very first story of them all, An Unearthly Child. Episode 1, being titled the same as the 4-part story as a whole, An Unearthly Child, opens when history teacher Barbara and science teacher Ian are intrigued by one of their pupils, Susan Foreman, who seems to have contradictory levels of knowledge, knowing a lot about science and history, but very little of current-day society. While Barbara suggested to Susan about having extra home tutoring, Susan rejected this, saying her grandfather doesn't like strangers. Barbara, finding this odd, decides to look up Susan's address, only to discover it leads to a junkyard. Ian and Barbara both decide to investigate this junkyard. Seeing Susan enter the junkyard, the two school teachers enter after her before noticing a police box that has an ambient humming sound to it. A man approaches the box and the school teachers hide. Thinking they can hear Susan inside, the teachers confront the man, who denies that anyone is in there. Hearing Susan again, the teachers push past the man to reveal that the box somehow has an interior that greatly outsizes the dimensions of its exterior. The teacher's entrance shocks Susan and angers the man, who reveals himself to be Susan's grandfather, called the Doctor, with the police box being their space-time ship that Susan has nicknamed the TARDIS. The Doctor decides that to protect Susan, he must take off and thus kidnap both her teachers. The TARDIS lands in what seems to be a barren desert as an ominous figure looms in the distance. The story continues in its second episode, The Cave of Skulls. The ominous figure turns out to be a caveman, revealing that the four of them have travelled back in time to the Stone Age. Both the Doctor and Susan are surprised that the TARDIS is still looking like a police box when its shape is supposed to change to match its surroundings. The Doctor gets taken by a tribe of cavemen and the others go in search after him. The tribe are trying to make fire to prevent themselves from dying out. The Doctor promises he can make them a fire without the need of killing anyone, but he discovers he has lost his matches. When one of the tribe's people, Cal, is on the verge of killing the Doctor, the other three show up and attack the tribe. Before Barbara can be killed, another tribe member, Zar, comes in and states that the four must be taken to the Cave of Skulls to be sacrificed to the orb in the hope that it will return, with this orb being the sun. The third episode is titled The Forest of Fear. Captured and tied up in the Cave of Skulls, the four travellers try and figure out how to escape. Meanwhile, the different members of the tribe are at odds when a female elder grabbing a knife secretly leaves, seemingly in an attempt to kill the travellers. It turns out the elder isn't trying to kill them and is in fact freeing them, leading to them being able to leave the cave and travel back to the TARDIS, though they find this difficult to achieve when they get lost in the woods. While Ian and the Doctor argue, Barbara trips and falls, alerting the other tribe members to their whereabouts. While trying to find the four, Zar is attacked by a wild beast, and against their better judgment, Ian and Barbara decide to try and help him. The Doctor does not want Susan involved in this, and is ready to abandon the pair and head for the TARDIS. Cal returns to the cave and kills the elder, telling the others it was Zar who set the captives free to selfishly keep the fire to himself. Cal manipulates the other tribe members into thinking Zar killed the elder, declaring himself the new leader of the tribe. Reaching the TARDIS, the Doctor, Susan, Ian and Barbara are surrounded. The final episode, called The Firemaker, has the four travellers be forcibly returned to the tribe's camp. The Doctor is able to convince the others that Cal is the true killer when he tricks Cal into showing his knife with blood on it, and thus the tribe attack him in response, leading him to leave the camp. Zar is appointed the new leader of the tribe, but instead of freeing the four travellers, he decides to place them back into the Cave of Skulls until they can teach him the secret of fire. Ian successfully makes fire for Zar and states the Doctor is the leader of their tribe. Cal, in the meantime, returns to the camp and attacks Zar. Zar eventually gains the upper hand in their fight and defeats Cal. The Doctor is disturbed by this, despite himself attempting to do the same to Zar earlier. Zar wants the four to become members of his tribe instead of leave, forcing them to stay in the cave permanently. Susan randomly placing a skull in the fire gives Ian an idea where they use four burning skulls to distract the cave member, making it look like they burnt to death. The four are able to make it back to the TARDIS with the tribe in hot pursuit. The tribe throw spears at the TARDIS just as it dematerialises away. The Doctor, unable to control the destination, is unable to return the teachers back to 1963. The TARDIS lands at its new destination. As the four exit, the radiation meter is left unnoticed as its dial increases and flashes danger. Doctor Who was created in 1963 by their BBC head of serials Donald Wilson and then head of drama Sidney Newman. Sidney, being new to the BBC, wanted to create a show that would cater to the lower class, something which came with some initial resistance from what is described as the more conservative old guard. C.E. Webber would pitch a bunch of different format proposals to Donald and Sidney, which formed the basis of what Doctor Who became. Sidney Newman, Donald Wilson, and C.E. Webber are co-credited as creating Doctor Who's format. Being the first ever Doctor Who story, An Unearthly Child was given the production code of simply the letter A. With the TARDIS being the only sci-fi element, this story is 1 part modern-day Earth, 3 part historical, with the first Doctor era mostly straying away from modern-day Earth stories in favour of sci-fi and pure historical ones, with the show's initial intention to be to educate and to not lean too heavy into sci-fi or fantasy elements. Each episode is structured to be roughly 25 minutes in length, with TV being much slower paced back in the 1960s, compared to today where we instead have 45 to 60 minute single episode stories with the odd 2-parter in a season. An Unearthly Child was written by Anthony Coburn, story edited by David Whitaker, directed by Waris Hussein, and produced by Verity Lambert. Verity Lambert, as producer, acted as what we'd now call showrunner, where she would be in charge of the show overall, including what scripts were chosen, the money the show had, the facilities it would use, the booking of the main cast, and who the directors would be. Verity was 27 at the time, and having never produced a show before, was backed by associate producer Mervyn Pinfield. Waris, as director for this serial, would be the one to decide the artistic direction and realisation of An Unearthly Child, including guiding the designers and selecting the cast for rehearsals. Doctor Who's original theme music was created by Ron Grainer and Delia Derbyshire at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and would be used in the show all the way until 1980's season 18. While it has been said that C.E. Webber wrote episode 1, Anthony Coburn is the one who is credited on its on-screen title card. C.E. Webber's association with episode 1 is most likely due to how he was originally set to write the pilot serial for the show after creating the format with Sidney and Donald. This story introduced the many staple concepts that would become commonplace within Doctor Who, those being the Doctor himself, the companions he travels with, the TARDIS with its concept of being bigger on the inside, as well as it taking on the form of a police box, as well as the 1960s trait of the TARDIS not having a set destination. The main cast of this story are William Hartnell as the First Doctor, Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and William Russell as Ian Chesterton. Barbara and Ian, being human teachers of separate subjects, allow the characters to be able to have a different approach to a situation. Barbara, Ian and Susan were created as different audience surrogate candidates to try and appeal to a wide audience. The Doctor, on the other hand, was to be the character who would be the one to introduce the audience surrogates to this unusual world of travelling through time and space. The 4 episodes were released on the then called BBC TV with the following dates. Episode 1, the 23rd of November 1963, Episode 2, the 30th of November 1963, Episode 3, the 7th of December 1963, and Episode 4, the 14th of December 1963. Due to the assassination of the US President John F. Kennedy the day before the first episode, it was decided to re-air Episode 1 a second time on the 30th of November, right before the second episode of the story, The Cave of Skulls. During production, this story was referred to as The Tribe of Gum and 100,000 BC, with it also having had a working title of Doctor Who and the Tribe of Gum. An Unearthly Child replaced the original intended story, The Giants, as the debut story for Doctor Who. The Giants, being written by C.E. Webber, as previously mentioned, was dropped after being half written. However, the general concept of what was The Giants would later be reworked for the first story of Season 2, released as Planet of Giants. An early idea during the Giants phase that was later scrapped was for Susan to have a crush on Ian, which would cause her friction with Barbara. Another idea had the Doctor contain flashes of garbled memory, which suggested that he was involved in a galactic war, something which, while being dropped from the classic series, would be revived by Russell T Davies for the 2005 revival. This version of the Doctor was given the year of 5733 as his origin. The policeman briefly seen at the start of the first episode was to have a bigger role in the Giants, with him discovering the TARDIS and seeing it shrink down in size. An Unearthly Child had already started being scripted by Anthony Coburn as a replacement for the Giants by the 14th of June 1963. Though the script itself is undated, this was before a reworked version of the script was submitted by the 21st of June. This version called in Susan, Suzanne, and Barbara, Miss Canning. The Doctor actually referred to himself as Doctor Who in this version, which was later changed to be a name that Barbara and Ian called him due to them not knowing his real name, before just being called the Doctor. A further, quote, much improved draft of episode 1 was submitted by Coburn on the 12th of July, with a few more coming afterwards in the lead up to the filming of the pilot, with the last being delivered 6 days ahead of schedule by the 17th of September. The 12th of July 1963 was also the date that Verity Lambert and Waris Hussein had lunch with William Hartnell to convince him to take the part of the Doctor, with 23-year-old Carol Ann Ford having also been chosen by this point to play Susan. The 18th of July 1963 would mark the date where An Unearthly Child was fixed as the first serial of the then upcoming new show, as well as the date where Verity and Waris took William Russell on a working lunch to convince him to play Ian Chesterton. By the 23rd of July 1963, the final 4 cast members had been confirmed, with Jacqueline Hill, a friend of Verity's, being the last to be cast. The actors are then all contracted on the 31st for the pilot episode, with options for a further 7 to 8 episodes included, with further episodes after that to be taken up at later dates to complete the planned 52-episode run. The 31st of August sees the title sequence shot with the HowlRound effect, though patterns used the Doctor's face were deemed too disturbing, so were dropped. However, this would later be repeated again with success during the middle of Season 4. The 18th of September sees the music for the 4 episodes created. The pilot version of Episode 1 goes on to be filmed on the 27th of September 1963 in Lion Grove Studio D. In early October, Sidney Newman requests the pilot episode to be remounted, requiring David Whitaker to rewrite it to address his concerns. This required the main cast to be recontracted, with this all happening by the 10th of October for all 4 episodes of An Unearthly Child and the first 4 of the next serial. The remounted version of Episode 1 is filmed on the 18th of October, with Episode 2 being filmed on the 25th of October, Episode 3 on the 1st of November, and Episode 4 on the 8th of November. Anthony Coburn was commissioned for a second story, though this story would ultimately never be produced, this being the unmade story, The Masters of Luxor. At one point, Episode 4 was considered to be called The Dawn of Knowledge. Annika Wills, who would later play Polly in Season 3 and 4, was one of the original audition candidates for the role of Susan, before Carol Ann Ford was chosen, though Annika ultimately did not attend the audition session. The TARDIS's chameleon circuit was chosen to break at the end of the first episode to save on budget and thus keep the same police box prop. A 16mm telerecording of the original pilot exists in the BBC archives. This story, like most of television during the 1960s, takes on a more teleplay type of format compared to modern TV shows, where the actors would film the story in sequential order and would not have the chance to do multiple takes, though they would do unrecorded rehearsals roughly a week beforehand. Back in the 1960s, it was BBC policy to reuse existing master videotape due to its high cost as well as its ability to be overwritten, combined with having seemingly no need for older shows to be retained, mixed with actor contracts only allowing a few repeats of their work. The BBC would not retain the original masters for Doctor Who. However, Doctor Who was one of the many BBC programmes with potential to be sold to overseas broadcasters, thus the BBC would create 16mm telerecording copies of almost all their episodes to be sold overseas. This is how we are able to watch this 4-episode story in full today. These telerecordings would exist in either a negative or positive form, with the negative acting as the master copy, while the positives were the ones sent to the other countries. Negatives being kept within the BBC Enterprise vaults are more sought out compared to the positive prints, due to them most likely having a better upkeep. However, a lot of these tele-recordings were not kept and were junked sometime after their creation. This has led to many of the Doctor Who episodes that were made in the 1960s to become lost media, currently amounting to 97 episodes in total. While thankfully An Unearthly Child isn't included in that figure due to its existing tele-recordings, there are multiple stories after it that are highly affected by this. On the 5th of February 1990, Doctor Who's growing VHS range would continue to make new releases, with An Unearthly Child being released for the first time on home media. Just over a decade later, the story would get remastered for another VHS release in September 2000. On the 30th of January 2006, the story was released on DVD for the first time as part of the beginning box set. An Unearthly Child is currently the only non-lost classic Doctor Who story to not be included on BBC iPlayer's back catalogue due to an ongoing dispute with its current rights owner. By the time of the making of this video, no Blu-ray release as part of the collection set of Season 1 has been announced, with the possibility of its release being brought into question due to the previously mentioned rights issues. An Unearthly Child has also been released in other forms of media. There was 2 separate novelisations released in 1981 and 1990, with well-known Doctor Who script editor and writer Terence Dicks being the author to adapt the story. The 1981 cover art was created by Andrew Skilleter, while the 1990 release was by Alistair Pearson. There was an audio novelisation of the story intended for release in November 2013, but this was delayed to February 2015 due to rights issues and the closure of its publisher, Audio Go. The author of this audio novelisation was Nigel Robinson. Personally, while this is far from my favourite Doctor Who story, I enjoy it for what it sets out to achieve. While Episode 1 is regarded higher than the other 3 by many, the story as a whole does a good job in establishing the groundwork for what was to follow. I like how we have a set of 4 characters that all stand out and have separate characteristics, with Ian being the action character who is more sceptical to situations because it doesn't fit within his scientific beliefs, Barbara being the history teacher who is more open to these unusual situations that come upon her, Susan being the schoolgirl acting as the audience surrogate for the younger viewers, though I don't think that she gets the best chance to show this and shows the least knowledgeable part of the production team. The last of the main 4 is the Doctor, the person responsible for taking these characters on this interesting journey and acting as the father figure of the group, with a character arc of his own. Ian is essentially the main character of early Doctor Who, with him fitting the mould of C. Webber's science fiction description of the handsome young man hero, with William Russell's performance always being a highlight of the episodes he's in, while the Doctor fits the description of what they call the third character of the maturer man of 35 to 40, with some character twist, that obviously being that he has a time-space ship and is not from Earth. Though for the final product, the Doctor did get aged up to be older than 40 to around someone more quote-unquote ancient, while William Hartnell was in his 50s when he played the character. Susan being the weakest link in the show also aligns with what C. Webber said about young heroines not commanding the interest of boys, though while I'm not sure whether that's still true over 60 years later, it does seem to explain why Susan didn't last long in the show back then. While these were just generic character descriptions that C. Webber talked about at the time, it's interesting to see how they do essentially fit what became the original TARDIS team. I am glad that an early idea of Susan having a crush on Ian was dropped, as it would have been very dated and not seen in the same way today that it was back in the 60s. This story does essentially feel like 2 separate stories, with the first episode having a different feel to it than the 3 other episodes set in the past. I will note that a quote-unquote retcon from this story is how it implies that Susan is the one who created the term TARDIS when she used the initials of the timeship's full name, whereas future stories essentially make it that the term TARDIS is actually the official terminology used for them by everyone. This is the first of many instances of retroactive changes to Doctor Who's lore, something that is more accepted by Doctor Who fans than Star Wars fans and the quote-unquote canon of that franchise. In my opinion, the story being enjoyable or not should take priority over whether one random thing from a previous story has been altered. This story, being set in the present day and then in prehistoric times, is able to show how well the BBC are able to pull off these settings. The thing I noticed in episode 1 that I found slightly odd was how when Ian and Barbara push past the Doctor, only to see that Susan is somehow at the other end of the TARDIS interior, far away from the doors, just after she tried to open them. The scene seems paced a bit too quick for me to fully believe Susan was able to get that far away from the doors by the time we see the interior. This is one thing that the unaired pilot does better in my opinion, with Susan being closer to the doors when the teachers enter. Another thing is how when the TARDIS is set for takeoff, that Barbara conveniently falls backward into a chair so she's placed directly into it when she is rendered unconscious. I feel in this situation, her and Ian wouldn't really have that much control over where they would fall. The Doctor in this story is far from the person he becomes later down the line, but that doesn't mean he's any worse off for it, as after all, he had to start somewhere, and in my opinion, the first Doctor is all the better for it, having the beginning of a character arc to grow from. Unfortunately, this leads some people to watch An Unearthly Child in isolation and assume this is just how the first Doctor always was, which isn't the case when you actually give the show a chance beyond its first serial and watch his character arc unfold. This story's downside in my opinion is its usage of Susan and Barbara, as after episode 1 they seem to fade into the background a bit, with Susan reverting into a stereotypical scared 15-year-old and Barbara becoming a damsel in distress, including being scared a lot and being made to fall over to advance the plot. Instead of Susan giving Ian the idea on how to escape, I think it would have been more interesting to have Susan come up with the plan, which would showcase her high historical knowledge that she was stated to have in the first episode. Another downside has to do with how, despite the four of them helping Zara on multiple occasions, he still doesn't seem to grow as a character and realise his mistake of keeping them captured, with the Traveller's multiple attempts to try to convince him becoming a bit repetitive. This is most likely due to how the story had to fill out the 4 episodes it was given. The 3 episodes set in the past does a good job with setting up the tension between the Doctor and Ian, with Ian by the end of the story coming to have a bit of respect for the Doctor when he declares him their tribe leader. We also get a bit of a showcase to contrast the characters, with Ian and Barbara being willing to help the injured Tsar, who captured them before. This being compared to the Doctor, who was willing to kill Tsar and abandon Ian and Barbara, who actively tried to help him beforehand. I prefer the version of An Unearthly Child that we got compared to the pilot episode, as I think the Doctor and Susan are a little too unearthly in the unaired pilot, which gives them a weird creepy vibe, especially when Susan frantically draws the shape, and the Doctor is doing his evil grin when kidnapping Ian and Barbara, making him come off a bit too villainy. All 4 of the main cast do an excellent job with what they're given in this story. They really sell the seriousness of the situations they are in. They are a core part of the groundwork in leading to this show being successful long term. In conclusion, while Susan and Barbara could have been utilised better, something which thankfully does happen with Barbara later on within the show, the story as a whole is a good starting ground layer as a lead-in to what Doctor Who ultimately became. Thank you for watching. Please see the video description below for interesting links, sources and credits. And if you enjoyed, please like, subscribe and comment. Until the next time, goodbye.